Winston Churchill, as you all know, once called Russia a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. That was in 1939. And I wonder today, 2022, if we need another layer to that puzzle. Churchill thought the answer to the riddle would lie in the defense of, or in how to defend Russia's national interests. In other words, he had a rational explanation for this mystery of Russia. But is there anything rational today in Russian policy? Putin has bet the house on what seemed like an impossible conquest that has upset the world order, has united Ukrainians as never before in their history, and united the West as we haven't seen it for decades. Can Vladimir Putin turn this around? What is Russia's goal? And what happens to Putin, to Russia, and to the Russian Empire if Putin has to back down? What is Ukraine's goal? And what does this mean to us? If anyone has answers, and I'm not saying that there are real final answers, there certainly aren't, but if anybody does have answers, Paul Goble is the man to ask. Paul served as an analyst on Soviet nationalities at the CIA when there was a Soviet Union. He was special advisor on Soviet nationality issues and Baltic affairs to then Secretary of State James Baker. That was at the time of the last major transition in Russia. He was director of communications at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, senior advisor at the Voice of America, and he was a professor in Estonia and Azerbaijan and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has degrees from Miami University in Ohio and the University of Chicago. He has been decorated by the governments of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania for his work in promoting the independence of the Baltic states, all formerly parts of the Soviet sphere. So Paul, please enlighten us.
Thank you, Roy, although you've put a high bar. Whether I can enlighten anyone, we shall see. What I'd like to do is to introduce some more complexity rather than indeed some more clarity, because it seems to me that one of our problems is that we have oversimplified what is going on. We've seen it as a win-lose situation for both Russia and Ukraine, and we've seen the events in Ukraine as discrete and isolated from a trend in Russian history that has its origins well before 1991 and is driven by an understanding of those events both in Moscow and Kiev, and by the lack of an understanding of what 91 meant and didn't mean in the West in general and in the United States in particular. We Americans love stories about David and Goliath, so it's not surprising that we're interested in following Ukraine and Russia. It certainly looks like we have Ukraine as the doughty little guy who stands up to the big thug, and we hope that will work out that way. It's also true that we have a passion as a country for thinking about triumph by someone who isn't expected to win at all over those who are viewed as certain to win. It's the stuff of legends. It's the stuff of movies. All of us have seen the movie Hoosiers about the tiny basketball team in Indiana that defeats the huge former state champion, about Rudy, the walk-on football player at Notre Dame who becomes a star, and Secretariat, who was dismissed by everyone as a failed horse who goes on to be the greatest Triple Crown champion of all time. This is the kind of thing we love to follow, and it affects how we view an awful lot of things going on in the world, including, I would argue, what's happening in Ukraine. Our understanding or our image of the world that we take from this, or that reflects that our interest in that, always has a common trajectory. First, there is the sense that the one player had no expectations of winning. If you go back to January and February of this year, you will find out that there was near unanimity, not just in Moscow, but in the West, that Putin was going to win in Ukraine, and he was going to do it very quickly. He might have problems, but there was no view that he would face a Ukrainian army that was capable of resisting and even resuming the attack and retaking territory. There was a view that there was no expectation that that was possible. Then, because of some things that have happened, I'll come back to, the Ukrainian army has done extremely well, and the Russian army has done extremely poorly. And there are very good reasons for that, that we need to pay attention to, because they may or may not be short-term. It's still true that failure is possible. We can point to Ukrainian failures, and we can point to the danger that Russia, which has a population 3 to 4 times the size of Ukraine, and that could mobilize a much larger army, at least in principle, could overwhelm Ukraine by masses of people. I, for reasons I'll go into, don't expect Mr. Putin to use nuclear weapons. I think nuclear weapons, I'm not sure, in fact, whether if he ordered a nuclear strike, it would be carried out. But what I am sure is that ordering a strike on Ukrainian territory would have consequences on Russian territory and for Russian politics that would be so enormous and so negative for the Putin regime that he will think not just twice, but many, many times before doing it. Now, given how we think about this trajectory that we see so many places in the world, it gets us in trouble, because it means that we think that victory, the defining winners and losers, is easy, and that it's once and for all. We tend to assume we like sports because sports has a very specific definition of what winning is and what losing is. In the case of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, victory and defeat are much more complicated and interrelated things. It is entirely possible that both of these countries will find themselves in the situation that if they win what they think would be a victory, they would find themselves in a situation which would bring about a future defeat. We need to be sensitive to that, because some of the cheerleading we do for one side or the other, based on the assumption that victory of one or the other is possible, ignores that possibility. It ignores the possibility that in many ways, the worst thing that could happen to Vladimir Putin's regime would be for him to absorb all of Ukraine. It would, in effect, set the stage for the second period of the dissolution of the Muscovite Empire, because it would mean that the percentage of ethnic Russians in the population would drop from its current about 65% down around 50% or even lower. And that would be lower than it was in 1991 when the USSR came apart. And it is also possible that if Ukraine wins the victory that it defines as a victory narrowly, which is to expel Russian forces from Ukrainian territory, including from Crimea, which is Ukrainian territory, that it would be creating a situation for revanchism that would mean that while we would have an armistice, we would not have a peace. We would have another situation where a war like this would happen again. Now, what I'd like to do in the little time I have is to talk a little more precisely about what the chances for victory and defeat are in these two cases, how we should think about them, because it is the third element that I'm really concerned about, and that is the impact of one or the other or both on the United States. The reality is that what is going on in Ukraine will have the most profound consequences on the United States' position in the world, and the international order which the US put together over the course of the 20th century, the great settlements of 1919, 1945, and 1991, all of which Vladimir Putin and the Russian state are calling into question right now. If Putin succeeds, or if the Ukrainians succeed, but in a way that sets up a series of new rounds of Russian aggression elsewhere, then the world that we knew and wanted, a world that would be based on the right of nations to self-determination, on the importance of citizenship over ethnicity, and on the principle that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a legitimate act. All of that will be cast aside, and we will be moving into a world governed by more authoritarian rulers, and which many of the hopes that we have for our society and for others will become impossible to carry out. But before I can do that, I need to talk a little bit about the background of all three of these actors in this drama, the meaning, especially the meaning of 1991, and the utter failure of the West and the United States in particular to see what happened in 1991, not as an end, not as part of a larger geopolitical reordering of the world, but rather as one step in a long process of which the war in Ukraine is a part. What is happening in Ukraine right now is a playing out of the violence we didn't have in 1991. It is not something new. Many people celebrated the peaceful demise of the USSR, the fact that there was relatively little violence. It wasn't that there was no violence, it was just that the violence was postponed. The fighting we have seen in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, and now in Ukraine is a playing out of what happened in 91, and we need to understand that if we're going to get it right. So first, let me make a few remarks about Russia's background and Russia's understanding of what's going on. First of all, there's no question that that Russians, including Mr. Putin, do not see 1991 as an end. They do not see that as the way history will play out. Mr. Putin is committed to revanchism and revisionism, and he's acting on that, and he's been doing so for 20 years. Second, he does not see Russians and Ukrainians as separate peoples, and therefore he sees there's no right for them the Ukrainians to have a separate state. For him, Ukrainians are Russians that Lenin and the Bolsheviks somehow called Ukrainians. That makes the current conflict for him a civil war. He calls it a special military operation, but that's in effect his way of saying this is not the kind of conflict or war that other powers should be involved in. This is a conflict within a single state, or a state that should be, and within a single nation, or a nation that should be, in his understanding. Putin has said all this for a very long time, and he has acted on it for a very simple reason. When the Soviet Union came apart, 3 previous states were restored: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. 11 new states emerged, and one became a subset of what the USSR had been. The Russian Federation is not a new country. The Russian Federation is a mini USSR. The percentage of ethnic Russians inside that country is small and getting smaller. The Russian government claims 78%. Most Russian experts would put that number around 70%. And some independent analysts say that the number, in fact, is now down around 55 or 60%, because many, many people who were forcibly re-identified as Russians or chose to be identified as Russians for the political benefits, therefore, are now re-identifying because they don't want to be Russians because of what's going on in Ukraine. Just like there were many Americans who traveled to Europe during the Vietnam War and presented themselves as Canadians because that was a way of saying, it's not my war. And then the same thing is happening in Russia. We'll come back to that as well. What was ignored and dismissed, because we dismissed this as just overheated rhetoric, we failed to understand that what Putin was doing was part of a larger plan, a plan that has widespread support in the Russian elite. It isn't as if Putin took power and imposed a particularly noxious form of ideas. The first president to use force against a population that wanted its own country after 91 was Boris Yeltsin. It wasn't Vladimir Putin. It's important to remember that. There's somehow this sense that this is all wrapped up with Putin, and that if Putin were to drop dead this evening, everything, we would have peace, happiness, and the world would go on to better and better things. That's nonsense. It is a systemic problem that arises from the failure to address the structural problems that the Russian Federation itself presents. Unfortunately, because the West didn't understand that, and to a large extent doesn't understand it now, we have behaved in ways in the past that guaranteed that what Putin did on February 24th was going to happen. Putin's Anschluss of Ukraine's Crimea in 2014, one that happened without much resistance. The Ukrainians didn't try very hard because they felt they would lose, and because there was little appetite in the West to stand up to Putin, and because there were so many people who were prepared to accept his untrue statements that Crimea, after all, was mostly Russian, an argument that we hadn't heard in quite such loud volume since people defended Hitler's seizure of the Sudetenland and his remilitarization of the Rhineland in the 1930s. Because Putin had that experience in 2014, he believed, and believes to this day, that he will get away with a massive invasion of Ukraine because he expects the Ukrainians to welcome him ultimately, and because he expects the West to remain divided, and that Ukraine can therefore be absorbed. Vladimir Putin, I think, the last 9 months have shown, is profoundly wrong. Ukraine as a whole is not Crimea, and the West, amazingly, is not what it was on February 23rd. If it has not gained very much in an understanding of the reasons that Putin is a problem, it has certainly shown itself far more willing to unite and take action to resist the kind of aggression we thought we would not see in the center of Europe again. Now, background for Ukraine. The most important thing to understand about Ukraine is it's not Russia. Ukrainians are not Russians. Ukraine is not Russia. Ukraine has a troubled but real democracy. In the 20 years since Vladimir Putin has been dictator of Russia, Ukraine has had half a dozen presidents, and they've come to power and they've lost elections and they left power. Its parliament is unruly, but it is reflective of the unruliness of the population. It is democracy that is being built. It is not an authoritarian state. It is part of the West. It is part of Europe. Moreover, Putin has done more than almost anyone else to bring this about. It is precisely because Putin has treated Ukraine the way he has that Ukrainians are now more united than they have ever been in their history. Ukraine is more ethnically Ukrainian than it has ever been in its history. Part of the reason for that is Putin's seizure of Crimea and the Donbass has removed a significant share of the ethnic Russians out of the Ukrainian political system, and Ukraine really can be an ethnic state, an ethno-national state, and it's going to be. It's going to move west. Had Putin behaved in the opposite way, had Putin wanted to keep Ukraine close, he could have achieved it by being friendly and nice to Ukrainians, by being aggressive. He has made Ukraine move ever faster to the west. It is not just that he has done that for Finland and Sweden, he has done it for Ukraine. And that's not going to change. Whatever happens, if Putin occupies Ukraine totally, there will be a partisan war, more or less forever. Russians will die. I believe that if he occupies Ukraine fully, the Russian Federation will disintegrate within 12 months of his doing so. And I think Putin understands that he is putting his own country at greater risk by what he would proclaim as victory than he would if he would not do something like that. Now, the West for some background, as I've said repeatedly, the West thought 1991 was a unique action, and it's treated everything since as if these things were unique actions. In fact, what we are seeing is the death throes of an empire that started actually long before 91, and it is continuing right now. The violence people expected with the demise of that empire is now coming out. It is coming out not simply because Vladimir Putin is in the Kremlin. It is coming out because unpacking an imperial state is a very difficult and usually bloody exercise. It's what the population wants, but that doesn't mean that it's easy or pacific. Moreover, the West has its own reasons for not being willing up to now to understand what's going on, and that is, as Putin understands perfectly well, the export of more than $1.5 trillion in capital from Russia by the oligarchs to Western banks and Western financial centers has had the effect of meaning that many in the West, many of powerful people in the West, are not prepared to stand up to Putin or try to bring his regime down because they are making enormous profits, even if they're only getting 0.1% of that as service fees for what they're doing in handling Russian money. Now, what Putin was wrong again about was that, in fact, capitalism is not the only force in the West. There are Western values, and those Western values we have been called back to those by what Putin has done in Ukraine and what the Ukrainians have said. A book has just been issued of the collected speeches of President Zelensky. I urge you all to read it. Zelensky has said some very important things that we should all be paying attention. Now, I think we have to focus very clearly on what exactly the goals Russia has in Ukraine and what goals the Ukrainians have. And let me go through and then how that plays out with us. With respect to the Russian Federation, as any number of people observe almost daily, Putin has constantly changed the goals he says he wants since February 24th, given what's happened on the ground. But every single one of the goals he's articulated has been based on the need, in his mind, for both territorial and regime change in Ukraine. Territorially, his demands have ranged from the complete elimination of Ukraine as a state and the abolition of the Ukrainian nation, its submersion within the Russian one. Some are only about the Donbass, the Black Sea coast, and the water supply and land bridge to Crimea. But all of them presuppose the right of a powerful state to seize territory regardless of the principles of international law. And if he gets away with that, if he achieves that, I felt if he achieved that in Crimea in 2014, then the international order is going to come crumbling down. It's going to have to be rebuilt. And rebuilding it is going to be harder than it was to assemble it in the first place, something we don't seem to have paid attention to. At the same time, Mr. Putin is committed, again, in every single one of his demands, of his goals, of his agenda, for regime change. He wants a government in Kiev that will do what he wants it to do, that will not want Ukraine to shift its focus from Moscow to the West, to the European Union and NATO, but rather remain part of the Muscovite Russian world that he wants. A victory then from Moscow would require both the destruction of Ukraine and make that effort impossible in the long run for the reasons I've already given. Putin is not, and this is something, if I take nothing else I say tonight away but this, I'll be pleased. Putin is not recreating the USSR as he thinks he is. Putin is recreating the situation that gave rise to the demise of the USSR. And what he is doing is creating a situation in which, by acting as he has in Ukraine, he is putting on the table the near certainty that the Russian Federation will come apart and that we will be dealing with a dozen or perhaps 25 new countries in finite time. That is something that he doesn't understand, that many of the people who talk about his policies don't understand. And what is interesting is if Putin doesn't want that to happen, but what he's doing is leading in that direction, those in the West who would like to stop Putin don't understand that the way in which Putin is stopped will determine how far the vociferousness of the Russian Federation will go. The great danger is not the demise of what is a mini empire into 25 states. The great danger is that we are talking about a system of war of all against, a Hobbesian struggle of all against all, of some kind of warlord situation, which would be extremely, extremely terrifying for the world and would likely then involve nuclear weapons. Ukraine's goals, it should be noted, are both territorial and regime change. In the West, people talk almost exclusively about Ukraine's territorial goals, which is the expulsion of Russian forces and Russian control from all of Ukraine, including Crimea. But importantly, and especially in the last 2 months, Ukraine has made it very clear that it is pursuing regime change in the Russian Federation. And it does not understand regime change as is usually understood in Washington as the removal of Vladimir Putin, but the restructuring of the political arrangements on the territory of the current country called the Russian Federation, so that we will not have an imperial state that will not only repress its own people, but repress others. On October 1st, just 3 weeks ago, President Zelensky issued a remarkable statement, which got very little attention here, calling on the peoples of the Russian Federation to refuse to serve in the army, the Russian army in Ukraine, and to rise up and defend their national rights against Russian imperialism. That is a very different and broader agenda to what he wants. For Ukraine, then, real victory requires both a territorial achievement and a regime change in a neighboring country. There's no doubt in my mind that it has the capacity to do the restoration of territorial integrity, at least for a time. But the question of whether it can go further than that depends in an important degree on whether it can get support from the West. And the fact that it is now trying to achieve regime change inside the Russian Federation opens up a whole new series of problems which are well beyond what I can talk about tonight. I just want to point to them. The United States and the West more generally, what are our goals? Our goals always, everywhere, whenever there's a conflict, we want the fighting to stop. We don't want a just settlement. We want the fighting to stop. The problem with that, of course, is that if all you do is stop fighting, guess what happens? The people who've achieved something through the use of force mostly get to keep it. That's a problem for us. We are in favor, the West generally, the United States, the United Nations overwhelmingly, for Ukraine to recover its territory. But the United States and the West at present do not support the Ukrainian goal of regime change, although it is almost certain that without regime change, it is unlikely that the world can move beyond where we are right now. That raises an important issue, again, larger than we can talk about tonight, but I'll just say it in bold terms. Putin is not the problem. Putin is a symptom of a deeper problem that 1991 did not solve. It did not lead to the end of an empire, but rather the reduction of the size of the empire still based around Moscow, and the assumption that getting people to stop calling themselves communists and start calling themselves democracy was sufficient, and that economic reform and capitalism were enough to change that equation. What we have seen, of course, is a combination of unbridled capitalism and rising authoritarianism, which are coming together as a kind of fascism. And it is not a fascism that is limited to Russia. Unless those deeper problems are addressed, there'll be no victory for the United States either. Now, where are we right now? Well, I think the best way to put what's on the ground is Russia is losing, but Ukraine isn't winning. Russia is being forced back, but Ukraine is not yet in a position to ensure that it will hold what it has retaken. The reasons Ukraine has been so successful are essentially three. First, Ukraine has been fighting with Western weapons that are at least a generation and sometimes 2 and 3 generations better than the weapons being used by the Russian forces. Second, Ukrainian forces increasingly are using Western NATO-style tactics, whereas the Russian commanders continue to use Soviet-style tactics, which didn't do very well in earlier conflicts, but were always based on the use of mass armies. And third, and most important, Ukrainians know what they're fighting for. They're fighting to defend their nation, and they're fighting to defend their country. A large number of Russians being mobilized by Vladimir Putin have no clear idea what they're doing other than obeying what the president has asked them to do. Motivation among the Russian forces is not great. And one of the signs of this is a wonderful anecdote. Russians convey almost everything that's important by anecdote, that Russians are now complaining that the Ukrainian government has failed to put enough operators at its telephone number where Russians can call in to find out what's happened to their sons, because they can't find that out from their own government. That's the kind of thing, when people say things like about things like that, it's not a joking matter after all. Now, we have to understand that this is not the end of this story. There are currently in Moscow people who are urging that Vladimir Putin and the Russian government expand the Russian army from roughly 1 million men now to 5 million men, to go back to a Soviet-style mass army. A lot of the people who want to do that want to use the same mass tactics that were used by Zhukov and others in the Second War and that have been used since. The problem, of course, is that a 5 million man army is a much bigger burden on a country the size of the Russian Federation, given its demographic problems, and that putting that many men under arms would destroy the Russian economy and likely spark a revolution. That doesn't mean that Moscow might not try it, but it does mean that this war almost certainly is going to lead to radical change in the future inside Russia. Moscow may threaten to use nuclear weapons, and many people, given how horrific those weapons are, may feel they have no choice but to defer to him. But if Putin used them, it would be a disaster for Russia and for him, physically and politically, and I think he knows that. I think there's been far too much attention to that, as he intends, without much thought as to what, in fact, could happen. Now, what does all this mean for us? The United States cannot afford a Russian victory, but it may not be in a position, or at least ready at present, to support a Ukrainian one beyond the battlefield. It's my belief that we have no choice but to continue to supply Ukraine with weapons and ammunition to fight Ukraine. And it is also my belief that the United States should take the lead in preemptively offering Ukraine NATO membership to send a signal to Vladimir Putin that his strategy has utterly failed. If the Russians are able to achieve territorial change, the international system and the United States' role in it will be severely compromised. It will be so compromised that other countries will also use force on their neighbors, and we will pay a huge price trying to put that back into the bottle. But if Ukraine goes beyond its territorial efforts, then we are going to see changes in Eurasia that are likely to be very dangerous indeed. It is worth noting that it's being reported that the FSB, the Russian intelligence service, is currently planning a major effort to destroy non-Russian elites with contacts in non-Russian elites inside the Russian Federation who have contacts with the West and especially contacts with Ukraine, because they see that as a threat to the survival of the Russian state. It is an indication of just how dangerous the world has become because of what we failed to get. The United States accepted 1991 as a golden victory, and it was a triumph, but it was in many ways fool's gold because it looked like something more than it was. We need to see what 1991 was as an unfinished task. There are many peoples inside the current borders of the Russian Federation and many regions that are currently labeled as Russian, such as the Cossack regions and Siberia, to name but two, who have aspirations for independence that should be met if at all possible. We need to be following Ukraine in what it is calling for, in recognizing that the threat from Moscow is coming not just because of Vladimir Putin, but because what happened in 1991 did not end the empire. It simply contracted its size and concentrated it in a single country. That doesn't mean that we should be launching a military campaign against Moscow or a nuclear war. It means rather that we should be relying, as many times we did during the Cold War, on the strength of Western ideas and institutions. The Captive Nations Resolution, Ronald Reagan's talk about the evil empire, and importantly, American non-recognition policy of Soviet occupation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These are models for what we can and should be doing. All of them worked, but all of them took a long time to work. Between the time that non-recognition policy was announced and Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania recovered their independence, it was 50 years. Solving the problems we face that are highlighted by the Russian invasion of Ukraine are going to take a very long time and a great deal of skill. But first and foremost, they're going to require understanding. We need to recognize what the world is really like in this case. Otherwise, we are going to find out that the victories we want to seek and that may even be in some cases achieved will rapidly turn into defeats, including not only defeats for the two countries immediately involved, but defeats for the United States as well. Thank you.
Wow. Well, you've given us a lot to think about, Paul. And I'm going to throw in the first question, and then we have quite a number of interesting questions from the audience. And the first question is just to elaborate a little bit on what you said about the coming apart of the Russian Empire into a dozen or 20 or 25 parts, and that a number of wars would start up. Could you just elaborate on where you think it will happen first, and what this will look like there and in the different parts? Do you see China, for example, as trying to take advantage of a breakup of the Russian Empire?
To answer your last question first, of course China will take advantage. Although China is smart enough to understand that seizing Siberia is a fool's errand if you can get what you want without acquiring the social welfare costs of occupying it. And I think China will mostly try to stay out as long as it can continue to treat Siberia as a colony, which is what it's been doing under Vladimir Putin's regime. I think the coming apart, however, of the Russian Federation is likely to take place less in the areas we tend to focus on first and foremost, which is to say the North Caucasus, Chechnya, Dagestan. I think those republics will move, but I don't think they'll be first. I think it's much more likely to emerge in the Finno-Ugric nations in the north and in the Turkic and Finno-Ugric republics of the Middle Volga. I would expect Tatarstan to be one of the very first. And I think it's worth noting that a group of Tatar activists a week ago appealed to President Zelensky of Ukraine to recognize Tatarstan as a temporarily occupied country, just as the Ukrainian parliament a week before that recognized Chechnya, Ichkeria, as a temporarily occupied country. And so I think I would bet first on the Russian North and on the Middle Volga. And I would say that we may very well be surprised by the emergence of some important Russian regionalism, which is not based on non-Russian ethnicity. Russian identity, one of them, another conceptual problem, which way beyond tonight's talk, is the assumption is that Russian identity is very strong and Ukrainian identity is very weak. I'm quite prepared to argue that of 15 nationalities of the titular nationalities of these post-Soviet states, Russian is the weakest of those identities because it is almost exclusively imposed from above rather than reflecting social cohesion from below, and that we're seeing it fragment. I mentioned a few minutes ago that many Russians are now describing themselves as anything but Russians. You're watching people call themselves Siberians who didn't before, and who are doing it as a way of distancing themselves from Moscow's policy. I think you're going to see more of that. And I think the Urals Republic that we saw partially emerge and then was suppressed in the 90s is entirely possible again. I would urge to pay attention to the Russian areas. I mean, it is sad, but we know less about what goes on inside the Russian Federation now than we probably did in Soviet times. And we know less about the Russian regions than we do about the non-Russian regions, because the non-Russian regions have immigrations and the non-Russian regions have a vastly denser internet presence. So if you wanted to find out about Tomsk Oblast, you would have to do some work. If you want to find out about Ingushetia, I can give you a list of 25 good websites that are reporting on English developments, some of them based inside Ingushetia, some of them not. And it's much easier. That distorts what we understand. We've paid less attention to Russian regions because we've somehow accepted the Russian claim that Russian identity is so terribly strong. I don't think it is. I think the Russian state is terribly strong, but I think Russian collective identity isn't. And I think that's something we need to think about in answering the question that you pose.
Our fellow board member, Robert Friedman, asked this question: why would the Russian Federation collapse if it occupied all of Ukraine?
First off, you would change the demographics of the country, whatever Putin says. Ukrainians are Ukrainians. If you add 35 million Ukrainians to the Russian population, the share of ethnic Russians of the population, even as counted by Moscow, which I think vastly exaggerates the Russian component of that country's population, would go way down. And that would mean that there would be greater demands by the non-Russians for representation, which, to be blunt, the Muscovite state isn't willing to grant. But there is another reason that I believe that. We talk about the impact of Russian losses in the fighting in the war in Ukraine. Occupy Ukraine. You will have Forest Brothers, Banderite resistance forever. you will have dead Russians coming home on a regular basis. And people will want to know what it is they've gained by having their sons die by being shot in the back or shot in the front by Ukrainian partisans. It took Stalin all of his remaining life between 1945 and 1953 to wipe out the Ukrainian resistance only in Western Ukraine. Does anyone really believe that Putin has anything like Stalin's apparatus to do the same thing? I don't. I think you will see vastly more dead Russians coming out of Ukraine. And if you want to take another way to look at this, Russian economists are now talking about how much money it's going to cost to rebuild even the parts of Ukraine they've already seized. We're talking billions and billions and billions of dollars, which the Russian government doesn't have. Either it doesn't rebuild these areas, in which case you will have a permanent underclass that will be resistant and more prepared to support violence against Russian occupiers. Or you will have other Russians who will ask questions that are being asked right now on a daily basis across the Russian Federation. Why aren't our roads being fixed if you're building bridges in Ukraine? Why aren't our hospitals staying open if you are sending in troops into Ukraine? People are asking those kind of questions now. 3 years, 5 years of occupation, they will ask more such questions. I've sometimes said, if you are really a Leninist, and I'm not, if you believe that the worse it gets, the better it is, then what you should say if you really would like to see the Russian Empire die is let Putin take all of Ukraine, because I can think of nothing that would accelerate the process of the demise of the Russian Federation faster than that. Yes, he might have a good parade in Moscow, but even as that parade would be going on, the social forces and the political forces underneath him would be eating away at the political foundations of his state, and the country would almost certainly come apart very, very quickly.
Why did Putin miscalculate so badly?
How many people? It is never easy for anyone to tell the person who's in the top job that he's wrong. It is especially difficult to tell the person in the top job if telling him he's wrong can cost you your career or even your freedom and life. Putin has had certain idées fixes for a very long time. He's not the only person who thinks this. There are many people in the Russian elite and many people in Russia who feel the same way he does, who feel that the West pushed them around, the West took things away from them, and it's time that Russia should get up from its knees and should push back. But the reality is, Putin didn't get good intelligence because he didn't want it. And if you don't want it, and you get rid of people who tell you the truth, you won't know it. One of the things that has struck me in my career is a limited number of people, even in the American political system, who believe that senior officials should be told things they don't want to hear. There have been some remarkable figures in our government at various points in the last 50 years who have made it their business to make sure that the president or the secretary of state is told things he doesn't want to hear. That's a rare thing. I suggest to you there are no such people in Putin's Russia. I suggest to you that Vladimir Putin doesn't get good intelligence because he doesn't want good intelligence, and that he believes that he is right. He believes that he has been right all along. He believes he was right on Crimea. He believes he was right on Georgia, and he believes that the West will ultimately break. One of the reasons he's confident of that, of course, is all this money that's floating about. But there's another reason, and that is the West will get tired very quickly. if this war had come to a head in March, Putin would have faced far more difficulties than he does now. More and more people look at Europe, look at the Italians, look at the behavior of the Germans, of course. He thinks that if he can get through this winter, that there will be a peeling off of support in Europe from what he sees as an American-led operation in Ukraine, that Ukraine will get tired, it will be ignored, and that the consequence will be that Russia will have another chance. And there will be people in the West who will say, and I'm sure he's right in this, well, it's too bad what happened, but we really have to deal with these people because they have nuclear weapons and because they're too important not to deal with. And that we just have to look the other way about what they've done. That's what happened after 2014. That is what happened after 2014. And that's one of the reasons that Putin thinks he's right. There are people in Russia who know he isn't, but most of those people are buying plane tickets.
Why would the Russian Federation collapse if it occupied all of Ukraine?
I'm convinced that he would face terrible problems from a partisan movement. He would face terrible burdens. He would face continuing international isolation, and he would face even more vociferousness, first among the non-Russian countries that came into existence in 91, but also more demands from areas like non-Russian areas and Russian regions far from Moscow. When one says the Russian Federation collapse, I try not to use that term precisely. I prefer to talk about disintegration. I see the orders going out and not being obeyed. I see that already happening. I see Putin giving orders that are not being obeyed. I see decisions that are made in Moscow that people locally are ignoring or turning to mean something very different. When one talks about a state falling apart, it can mean coming apart neatly, the way the USSR did or appeared to in 91, or it can mean warlordism. And I think that that's also a possibility. I do believe, I hope actually, that we will see some of the submerged nations and countries, in fact, get a chance to have their space in the sun. I think there's a very great danger that that process will be violent and vicious, and that at a minimum, it's going to take a certain amount of time. What I do not see is how a Russian state, as currently constituted, that is to say, hyper-centralized, can continue to run a territory that large, to finance a central government that is increasingly out of touch with the rest of the country, where you have really two Russias. You have Moscow and you have everyone else. And I think that those social and political pressures, and I think they become political pressures because the officials in the regions, even if Moscow appoints them, have to respond to the social forces around them. That doesn't mean they do what the social forces want, but they have to do something. And that doesn't mean they simply do whatever Moscow wants. Everybody in the West called attention to the fact that Vladimir Putin said he was ending mobilization in 2 weeks, about 2 weeks ago, okay? Supposed to end by the end of October. What they didn't notice, except with the case of Kadyrov of Chechnya, who announced he didn't need to do that, he didn't have mobilization because he'd already mobilized 146% of the population, was that Putin's move happened after more than a dozen heads of federal subjects said, we have to have this wrapped up. And they said it because there was resistance. They said it because it was costing them their ability to do their jobs. There is real politics in Russia. It isn't what we would like. But there are people who have to act, and I believe that those people's actions will ultimately have the effect of weakening that state, and taking in all of Ukraine would put stress on the system that I don't believe it could survive. And I believe we need to be very clear about that to the Russian leadership, Putin and everyone else. How could he exit gracefully? I read an article by a very wise Russian sociologist last weekend, who said that the Russian people will accept a new campaign marching on Kiev, or an announcement that we should negotiate right now. And I think that's true. I think Putin could change. What I don't believe is that it would be anything more than a tactical move, by which I mean that he would perhaps end this particular war right now. But he's not going to give up Crimea. He's not going to give up the Donbass, and he's not going to give up the land bridge to Crimea. That means Ukrainians will not accept that as a loss they're prepared to take. The West may tell them to, but I'm pretty confident Ukrainians will fight on as long as they can if that's what the deal they're being offered. They will see themselves as having been betrayed. So I think Putin could announce negotiations. He might not be able to find someone in Kiev to talk to him unless he was prepared to do things that he says he won't do. So it's not going to be easy. I wish him luck if that's what he's wanting, even to stop this conflict, because I don't like to see the bloodletting of innocents in Ukrainian cities that Russian forces are now bombing.
The Western powers, U.S., seem to have extraordinary intelligence about Russian military tactics and strategy. Is this a function of dissidence within the Russian military?
Well, I don't work in the government anymore, so I'm not privy to what kind of penetration of the Russian military we may have. I think that the amazing thing, as someone who reads the Russian media on a daily basis, is how much information is in the public domain. You don't need to have some kind of special agent in place to know what's wrong with Russian military tactics. There are a whole slew of highly professional military analysts in Moscow, and now some of them in emigration in Riga and also further west, who are writing about this with a great deal of authority, and presumably on the basis of a large number of contacts. It's my impression, and I hope I'm right, that those kinds of sources are being used as well as others. But we know an awful lot, and I suspect that there are a variety of national technical means that are giving us even more information.
What is the Wagner Group? And I think I read just yesterday in the Washington Post that the leader of the Wagner Group has now been outspoken against Putin. Can you comment?
Putin has engaged in many activities which are counterproductive to his own interests. Creating the Wagner Group was very useful for certain kinds of purposes, but once you get people who have guns on their own, who can then act in their own agenda, it's quite amazing how they do things that are not necessarily what you want in every and all cases. We've seen that in the case of Kadyrov. Everyone talks about Kadyrov's plan to occupy all of Ukraine. What they don't talk about is Kadyrov's demand that the Russian government back off from its censorship of Islamic materials. I think that I've never thought that the Wagner Group was nearly as important as the Western media has made it, because it's certainly photogenic, and there are a lot of articles about it in the Russian press. I think far more important are the so-called battalions that Putin has called up or allowed the regions and republics to form. There are several in about half of the republics. They aren't full-scale battalions because they haven't been able to recruit enough people to staff them. But I think one sign that's more important than the statement of a single Wagner leader, as mediagenic as he may be, will be when it starts happening that these people refuse to go to Ukraine or refuse to take orders or begin to use their forces or their weapons against Russian officers or against Russian troops, as we have seen already on a couple of occasions. So the Russian army is in really deep trouble. The Wagner comment is just one part of it, but I think it's a less important part, even if easier to report than some of these other stories.
You dismiss the possibility of Russia using nuclear weapons. Why?
Well, Vladimir Putin has said that if there's a nuclear war, all Russians will get to go to heaven and everyone else will get to go to hell. He may very well believe that. The fact is, he uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and there's going to be radiation all over parts of Russia. He may not give a damn, okay? But other people will. Most people don't remember that when Chernobyl happened, which was in Ukraine, large areas of the Russian Federation were contaminated as well. And Russians have not forgotten that fact. So you use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, you're not going to contain it. You're not going to be able to limit its impact to Ukraine. Using carpet bombing, even much more massively than Russia has so far against Ukrainian cities, I think that offers Putin more bang for the buck and with less risk. I think using nuclear weapons crosses a line where he would find that the world would not just bow down, but where the degree of unity in the West that we see today would only increase, and that Russia would be an international outcast for as long into the future as I at least can imagine.
Well, Paul, all I can do is thank you deeply for such a thoughtful, thorough, and detailed analysis. The only sad part of it is the content. That what you're suggesting is that we're in for a very long and a very painful period, in fact, to come. That there is no happy outcome to be seen. It's really going to take very careful handling by the current American president or anybody who succeeds him to manage. It'll certainly not be a piece of cake like the post-Cold War period seemed to be for American leaders. Rather, it's going to be hugely complex to manage because one way or the other, it sounds like the Russian Empire could very well be on the chopping block. Paul, we really thank you. We're going to have you come back again and bring us up to date in a period of time. And you're always our welcome guest. So thank you to you, and thank you for our members for attending. And thank you for the excellent questions as well.